Susan Gardner here for Municipal World. We're at the 2019 conference of the Municipal Innovators community in the District of Muskoka. Joining me in the Municipal World Media Center is Jeff Fielding, Chief of Staff for the City of Toronto. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, you've got quite a history of working with local governments in Canada. 20 years in a city manager, chief administrative officer type position. Now working for the very populous City of Toronto. I'm wondering if we can talk about some of the insights that you have around innovation and what that means in different communities and what you've learned in your experience from those different communities.
Well, we heard about partnerships today, and I think that we need to be able to share information with municipalities and our other partners. So whether it's hospitals, universities, anybody who's in the public realm, as well as some of the private sector that are now branching into providing infrastructure support for municipalities. But the best thing you have to do, and I guess look at a little bit more precisely, is that you're not just copying common practice. You're actually looking for best practices. So it's all too easy to go on the internet this day and age, look for something that somebody's doing elsewhere and say, well, that's the best practice, let's just copy that. If you're copying the best solutions, if you're copying the best practices, you're going to be able to move yourself ahead. But the other side of that is making sure that you're building alliances.
So when we talk about what distinguishes a best practice for you? How do we distinguish what's a best practice from perhaps good or safe practice and an emerging practice?
I mean, I think that's a very good question to ask, because at the end of the day, it's about breakthrough. When you're talking about private sector, they're always looking for that breakthrough technology, that breakthrough product. So what's the equivalent in terms of municipal government or government in general? So we need to be looking at things that are going to advance us quicker, that are going to leapfrog us faster, that are going to miss a few stages along the way so that we actually know that we're making progress at a faster rate. So cycle time needs to increase. So it's looking for those types of things that will help us leapfrog our existing set of circumstances and find where we need to go.
So pooling some of those resources together to achieve mutual goals.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is sharing information. So this is a really touchy subject in day and age, isn't it? Both access to information,
Yes.
the privacy that people have. But we know that, if we have somebody who's dealing with an issue at the hospital, chances are we're dealing with that same person at the municipal level. So how do we make sure that that person's not falling through the cracks on either side of that relationship? So we need to work through that data, the privacy of data, but at the end of the day, use analytics to basically do our services differently.
So when we're dealing with personal information in the context of public sector and not-for-profit organizations, there's some concerns there and some things that need to be observed in dealing with that. As we're bringing a private sector organization into the mix of that collaboration, there's some additional concerns. And what's your feeling about that? How is that best managed? And how do you allay public concerns around that bridging that divide between public sector and private sector interests, and ensure that we're not, trading off people's information?
Well, I think if you look at the Google sidewalk labs in Toronto, I think that's first and foremost a consideration of what the conversation is. What information are they going to gather about us? How are they going to use that information to their benefit? I mean, we all know that if you have better data, you can serve people better. But you also know that you're gathering information that people might not necessarily want you to know.
Could also be used to manipulate them, for
That's
example.
the point. And I think that we're going to have to work through that. Because ultimately we're at that stage right now where cities just simply don't have the resources, whether it's financial or manpower, to be able to devote towards the solutions that we need. We're going to have to rely on those partnerships. And we're going to have to rely on the interest that the public or the private sector has in cities today. And you see this. I mean, there's technology that's emerging on a regular basis now, whether it's mobility, whether it's 5G, technology that's coming forward. You can see the investment that's being made by private sector in infrastructure that traditionally has been the domain of the municipality. So we're going to have to work through that with the private sector and figure out just what that relationship and partnership will look like.
And what will be, to what extent will the community need to be engaged in that conversation?
I think they're engaged already. I think that they're very vocal. If we've seen anything right now, the shift, government used to be something you used to do for people. Now it's something you need to do with people.
Yes.
And so, you know, people aren't shy any longer. They're prepared to tell you what's on their mind and what they want and how they want it. And so working through that engagement process so that you give meaningful results as a result of involving people, I think that's critical.
So we talked about engaging people outside the organization. Today you spoke about engaging people inside the organization in the innovation process and building a culture. I want to talk about that.
Sure, I think that one of the things that we struggle with is just risk, and we've always been blamed for risk aversion. One of the things is that making mistakes always seems to end up on the front pages of the newspaper. So there's a reluctance to take to try something different, an experiment. So we need to be able to build a culture that will enable us to fail from time to time. And we saw that, in that conversation we had at noon hour today, just about how you be able to build that culture so that you can experiment, challenge yourself. Not everything's going to succeed, but when you're using public money and something isn't successful, therein lies the rub. And so we have to be able to figure our way through that process so that we can challenge ourselves to do things differently, potentially not succeed, learn from that, and advance.
So how do you succeed in doing that in a public sector organization where there is, adversity to risk, and although we can say it's a safe environment to fail, there may be cases where that's not really the situation.
I think you're right. But this is a good example. So this innovation conference has been going now for 5 years. Mayor Lehman talked about it starting in Barrie, and so it's not that old. But you can see now we're up to 190 people here that are, in this conference to share ideas, to be able to, to support one another,
Yes.
to be able to discuss process, discuss successes and failures. So we're building a culture, I think, within organizations that will, from small to large. I think that's the other thing that's interesting today, right? What you're seeing, and not just the big municipalities, or not just the small municipalities. All the municipalities are participating. They all need to be able to deal with innovation. So I think that's the culture that I think will emerge from the conversations it's actually having with these types of people that are go back to the municipalities and be able to have that conversation in a wider ranging discussion.
So something you talked about the role of elected officials, and certainly you've gone to some communities that you've gone there in a leadership role at a time when the community was challenged. I think that's probably the case in all the communities you've been to, and Calgary in particular stands out. And you did some incredible things there, and left on good terms, which is often not the case with the city manager or CAO.
I'm very grateful for that.
Mayor Nenshi said, I think, commented that you were a remarkable leader, and that they were sad to see you go. What do you attribute that success to in building that kind of relationship with the elected team? Because it's a difficult thing.
The thing I learned a long time ago when I first took my job as a city manager was that the really only value that I had to the organization was my relationship with council. If I didn't have the ability to influence them, to have a conversation that might be quiet from time to time, to pull them aside and have a sideboard conversation that might change their opinion or mind about how they're behaving on the floor of council and how they're dealing with our staff, to create that respect that's necessary between the council and administration, but also to find the solutions that council feels are necessary. So, they rely on us. They're not charged with coming up with the ideas, they're charged with leading. And so they depend on a good administration to find the solutions to the problems that are, quite frankly, vexing in most municipalities.
Yes.
You know, and if you can build that relationship up with them and show them that you've got their interests at heart and that you're going to be able to be the one that's going to lead them to the solutions that will work in their municipalities, that's the first step, and you can go a long ways on that relationship.
So from an innovation standpoint, what is one of the things that you're most proud of your team accomplishing in Calgary during the time that you were there?
You know, we started with an innovation lab. Some of my folks are here today. It's even more important now than what it was when we started it. So it was a bit of a grind at the beginning. I mean, what was this innovation lab going to do? How are they going to affect change within the organization? What value, because we're investing resources, what value are those resources going to come back for the politicians? So, you know, we were off to a little bit of a slow start, building some momentum. But in the day and age we live in now, and especially in Calgary, where you know you need to find those efficiencies, and you'll be able to find the changes in municipal government responding to an economic downturn, and where the businesses are hurting, and where there's the loss of $12.5 billion worth of assessment. 35,000 employees were lost in the downtown. So you need to be able to bring that innovation to the table. And now we're starting to see the politicians showing an interest. And every dime matters. So it really is coming back to the fact that if you can save a couple of thousand, a couple of million, it has the same impact. And you learn from that process. So the people that we have in the lab today are now facilitating that change, facilitating the discussion about how to be innovative and creative. It's funny. It is a play. It's all about playing. We use different words all the time to describe innovation, but in children, they go and experience the world every day, and we call that play. Somehow for us, it's called innovation, right? So how do we learn to play again, and how do we be able to, advance the ideas that everybody has that will, through a collaborative exercise, bring them to the fore.
So you've moved on now from Calgary, your new capacity, Chief of Staff in Toronto. What role does innovation play for you today in that role?
Well, I think we're starting to see that immediately. I mean, the new city manager, Chris Murray, has an agenda that is different than what the previous city managers had in Toronto. So it's about building partnerships in the community. It's about being innovative and creative in terms of the solutions. It's about being able to stay within the means that you have available to you. So we don't have bags of money, and it's not about, there's nothing that a tax increase can't fix. It's about using your resources wisely and bringing new challenges to the table with new solutions. So I think that's really where we're at right now. He's into his 1 year, his first year anniversary, and I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to be part of it.
Well, we'll be excited to see things as they continue to develop in the city.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
I'm Susan Gardner from Municipal World, here with Jeff Fielding from the City of Toronto. We share your stories.